So we were talking about visas and movement, and we were the countries who were represented, I think is important, is Kosovo, United Kingdom, Norway, Pakistan. So all countries that at the moment we feel we have complications around visas and movement. And the broad scope of our discussion, which is wide-ranging, sort of had two particular areas. So we discussed kind of ethical boundaries and a kind of ideology and ethics around that kind of visa movement. And then we also had some really practical conversations about tactics, what we could do, what we might want to do. Okay. So I'm going to hand over for ethics.
Okay. So we, in that regard, we initially started from something very specific. So we started by discussing the work of one artist here at Manifesta, Liz Broton, a Spanish artist who has a work here, which is, I don't know if anybody, if you've had the opportunity to see it, but it's based on this idea of swapping keys with people, right? I hope I'm getting it right, the details. And she's an artist from Spain, which is a country that doesn't recognize Kosovo, and one of the most difficult, if actually impossible, countries for Kosovars to go to and to visit. So there's even no visa granted in that regard. And I think what was particularly interesting with her piece of work is because, and also there was this letter that we had, a text of hers that she had written in this regard, is that she talks about the moment of discovering this particular reality, so something that she was not aware of. And I think that is something very important for all of us to recognize, because there's a lot of times where we're not informed or we're not aware of certain injustices or inequalities that exist somewhere else, and we feel that they are removed from us. And if we do not have the knowledge or the information about them, then it also removes that sense of kind of, let's say, responsibility, or that also that sense of what can we do to maybe change the situation. And change does not always need to be like big and grandeur. Change can also just be about just actually being informed and being aware that especially artists are working in different contexts, in different environments, and there's different realities that affect their work and how much they can participate and equally participate, be it in biennales or other kinds of artistic moments, to say, like in a general sense. So this is something that we started discussing from this ideological and also ethical point of view, that we should try as much as possible to kind of remove that lack of knowledge about one another, because if we're not, as I said, if we're not aware of, let's say in this case, the particular context of Kosovo, then we kind of we end up in situations or in positions where we just contribute to normalizing practices that are problematic, and we end up contributing to situations that normalize injustices and inequalities. And I think this is more or less what we were discussing, from an ethical point of view, and also from the point of view of where biennales can actually play a role, because I don't think we should just we should just not be silent about it and just accept them as such, but think of how can we problematize it, first of all, as a practice, but then also how can there be specific actions and tactics that can be undertaken that in the meantime can help alleviate the situation, but always keeping under pressure that bigger theme that this is a practice that in general needs to be challenged and potentially changed. So now we'll pass it on to you.
So to tactics, we were still trying to hold these two things in place at the same time. So to have an ethical position, but also to be practical. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes what you're doing is a workaround or a solution that doesn't acknowledge the bigger narratives that are at play. But we talked about the power as institutions, as organizations, to speak up to power, to advocate for artists, to advocate for mobility, for raising awareness of these issues, and to think really concretely about that. We had Judy from AN Artists Association, so we talked a little bit about the power of artists coming together and then working internationally to figure out modes of kind of pulling together a kind of international visa, a way of moving globally for artists that could be done through UNESCO or connecting really practically. We thought about biennials making commitments, making ethical commitments to artists when their visa doesn't come. So can we agree as the IBA that if we commission an artist but their visa doesn't come, that we still commit to realizing the work in some way, even in another country, and to supporting that artist with a visibility in whatever way is possible within our biennials? We talked about IBA, whether it has a role to play in supporting visas, in doing that kind of paperwork. How might that happen? How could we explore that? It's so complex politically that we acknowledge that as well. But those were all the things we discussed. I think
So hello, I'm sitting here alone, but I think my colleagues will help me after filling me in if I miss anything. I think we were talking about conflict in IBA and how we could deal with conflicts in times of conflict in international dialogue. We started, although, to start with talking about types of conflict because they're external and internal. And external, typically war. We talked about Iran, Israeli, Palestine, China, Taiwan, Italy, Russia, Ukraine, right-wing government. There's so many. Global issues, inclusivity, but also internal. In cases of, say, Documenta, there might have been some internal conflict, but we decided to focus a bit more on the war or the external conflict. And in times of conflict, how can we maintain our dialogues, especially with the IBA being a cultural, and trying to look for a cultural language that enables us to have this dialogue. But of course, in the course of our discussion, we found that it's not so easy to keep these discussions going. And also we were saying then, so should we make a statement? Maybe issue a statement. But then we were also discussing how statements bring another statement, and are statements relevant in this case? And there was another issue about how do we represent voices and how do those issues come into conflict with organizations. So in a way, we came into the ideas of, so what can biennials do support each other in these cases of times of conflict? And we should focus on why biennials are important to us. And maybe we thought that maybe we should rework on the IBA mission statement or work on such a way so that it's not a statement, but an idea to initiate a dialogue based on a mission statement type of wording. This is referring to the icon museum definition, for example. And in case we work on such wordings, maybe the key words would be something like freedom of artistic cultural freedom, experimental platform, intercultural dialogue. And these become like independent words where we can start working on. And also, I think particularly in these terms, we were very focused on giving a protected space for dialogues at IBA, but also not to pressure people into peacekeeping in these situations. And also we needed to agree that we all agree to disagree in some cases. But in any case, I think mediation would be very important in these cases, and the mediation of all levels of community should be practiced, although the word mediation is quite vague and also differs in cultural context. So we were finding out here in Kosovo, mediation meant more of conflict mediation rather than education when they started their Manifesta education. So it's interesting to see what we mean by mediation, what the process of that should be. But we thought that for IBA, we should be prepared for mediation and creating protected space or safe space. And so we thought that maybe instead of a statement, maybe we could work on some wording that we could agree to on a conceptual level. My colleagues should fill me in on something that I missed, some bullet points, something that adds to context. Okay, thank you.
So we were focusing on legacy, archiving, but I think more specifically legacy in a wider sense. We had with us colleagues from Ljubljana Biennial, from Manifesta, from Sharjah Art Foundation, and from Sonsbeek, which I think is relevant because most of these are institutions with a certain history and with a certain structure behind it. So I'm very aware that what I'm talking about, or what I will be talking about, and what we did discuss, comes from a very different position than institutions that have less of a structure behind them. And I think this is very relevant if we want to think about the role of archiving, the role of legacies in other contexts that we could not take in account because we didn't have their voices. However, most of the discussion rotated around a legacy of biennials that builds around specific spaces that are maintained over time and that create a sense of long-term legacy, long-term presence, and continuity. And I think this is the point which is critical for other biennials that don't exist basically in between editions. However, what emerged is the potential and the efforts to create a legacy through social programs, educational programs, through publications that engage with themes that are relevant for a specific city, for a specific theme that is relevant within the context of a city in which the biennial takes place. We also talked a lot about the necessity to have specialized individuals within a biennial to be able to archive things, to archive the biennial itself. And we heard the interaction with different institutes or bodies outside of biennial to instigate this process. Hedvig spoke about the role of the Getty Foundation quite early on in Manifesta to turn an archive that was held at Hedvig's house into something public, into something sustainable, and so on. And this brought about the idea or the question of how to handle archives which are mostly held by individuals that initiated a biennial, for example. And the need to try to render them public in a way or another. We didn't find an answer to this, but it is a very important theme that I think we should find the time to discuss at an IBA level if there are ways in which we can initiate a dialogue with specific experts on this theme and so on. The other big thing that we talked about is, and that also comes down to legacy, the relationship with local authorities and local funders and so on. Both in terms of an awareness of an instrumentalization that comes from these funding bodies and from cities in particular towards a biennial in terms of urban marketing, in terms of making a city attractive for specific groups and so on. But also in terms of building long-lasting relationship with a local authority, which guarantees a continuation of funding, which guarantees a legacy for the biennial itself. Again, no answers, but at least questions that I think are interesting to think about. The other, and this was one aspect. The last aspect that we did talk about is, and this is something that came up also recently with a few other member biennials, is the attempt of breaking that two-year cycle. And again, Hedvig brought the example of Manifesta that works 2 years in preparation already, plus the 2 years of the quote-unquote biennial itself. This is, of course, something that certain biennials can afford, others cannot. But to start imagining a way to work on longer-term projects while also maintaining the 2-year cycle or 3-year cycle that an institution follows. I'm going through quickly if I'm missing something. Last question. Last idea or last topic talking about legacies is to try to instigate specific projects with either a specific curator that worked on a biennial or with a specific team that can continue and take a life of its own and that somehow still maintains the history and the memory of a specific biennial. Again, Hedvig had the suggestion or the memory of a few projects initiated by some of the curator of Manifesta that continued with publications throughout the years, or with specific institutions actually that were funded as a consequence of Manifesta being in a specific space or in a specific city. But you can imagine it also as projects that initiate from an artist that works socially engaged with socially engaged art, and that continue beyond the specific biennial, and how to maintain that. That's the big question, of course. How to secure a continuation to these projects. I think that more or less covers.
Hello everyone, I'm Gabriela. I coordinated with Jordi Ferreira the number 4, which is learning from biennials, can you imagine educational programs across different biennials. I think I will summarize, but please my colleagues from the group can add to if they want at the end, that the main kind of questions raised, I think it resonates with what Aki said on the group, the second group, which is how to understand this mediation role, cultural mediation role, how this is something that we don't agree with in these different places, or how we think about this role in different institutions as guides, invigilators, or visitors, or assistants, or art educators, or so how this role we can kind of understand better this role and support each other to understand better this role as well, or how these different institutions, like for example, Venice Biennial started to use like live catalogs as an alternative to that, or the Sobat Documenta that kind of apply to a better use of the word for their projects at the times. So how can support each other to understand better how to use mediation programs. This is something that we asked about, and how we can support each other to that. And then Ushan from the Biennale said something that was very important, why this is the last thing that we have at the end in our budgets to support. So the second item, I think, is usually budget for education. But budget not in the sense of like why we struggle to have budget for that, but also how we improve our budget, focusing to better working conditions, on the importance of a care training to our staff, how do we understand the value of the work of these people into the learning programs, and also how we can improve on not using volunteers, but also understanding how to support the staff. And then Jordi explained the situation on the Manifesta here. On this, they have this really big group of supportive staff that also had a specific training school for them, and how this is important to pay them like a minimum wage and not to use volunteers instead. I think these are the two main topics that we work with, and I think what we understand that we can expand in IBA as a platform is how we can create exchange programs like residencies in between institutions, then provide us a kind of an exchange of ideas, and also how we can expand this at the time of understanding of how to work a longer time together. Thank you very much.
I'm Barb. I run the Biennale of Sydney. So our question was how to improve and ensure the inclusion of all communities, including marginalized in biennales. We challenged the question, of course, even the adapted question, just that it does imply power as center, and ultimately taking it from a conscious position of who you're trying to include and who is representing those communities that you're looking to engage with. So one, we weren't actually asking a lot of questions, we were trying to find solutions, I think. One was to be careful of the politics of the place and really be conscious of what resonates in that place, what's appropriate for that place, because it's not universal. One conversation might be appropriate somewhere that's completely inappropriate somewhere else. And thinking of that in terms of care. So biennales having a responsibility to support the artists and engage with the communities that ultimately they're representing and they're in dialogue with. of the organization taking that responsibility and doing that cultural consultation and that groundwork, that practice to be able to support whoever it is that you're including. That the team needs to reflect the communities that they represent, that ultimately the Biennale needs to be part of that community, acknowledgement that they're in that community. There's no, again, that top-down, other inside. For a Biennale to really be successful, you need to be among that community, working with that community. So the team really needs to be embedded within and have proper representation, whatever that might mean, with the communities you're engaging with. The other thing on care is it's not just in the lead up to a biennial, it's also being agile so that whatever discussion becomes pertinent in that moment, biennials are grow to kind of be responsive and provocative and all of those things. So it's once you've made that decision, being able to change on a dime. If another budding conversation becomes more relevant in that moment,